spring of 2001, I lost my dad very suddenly. I was 25 years old, in my first year of marriage, first year of full-time ministry, and it just wrecked me and kind of went into a tailspin with my faith. And it was 2 years later, I got a phone call from a high school football buddy of mine telling me he was going to run the Chicago Marathon, asked me to come watch him run it, and the Holy Spirit just whispered to me, do this. And so I'd never run a 5K. I was a former college defensive lineman. At the time I weighed about 265 pounds and couldn't run around the block, but I knew that God was telling me to run that marathon. I remembered seeing all these charities at races, wearing these different colored jerseys, red and yellow and blue, and all raising money for different charities. Most of them were medical research. But just before my dad died, I actually had the chance to go on a trip with him. That trip really wrecked me. It was my first experience with global poverty. And I knew I wanted to do something about the issues these kids were facing around the world, but I didn't think I wanted to be a missionary, and so I didn't know what to do with it. So I just had put it on the back burner, and it was just kind of sitting in the back of my mind, on my heart, not knowing what to do with that. God showed me, you could do these races and help those kids. And so I went home from that bike ride and just started writing all my ideas down. And within a couple of months, I found myself presenting that idea to World Vision. And within a few months, we launched Team World Vision. As human beings, we wear these grooves in our life. And our natural bent is towards kind of keeping our direction, keeping our habits, to keep doing things the way we've always done them. And so change is very difficult. And I think when we look at people's lives and people who have made significant changes, it typically takes some kind of moving action to enter their life. For me, losing my dad was this moving action, right? I'm going in this direction. I'm kind of putting all these things on I know I need to lose the weight. I know I've got this heart for global poverty, but just gonna keep kind of going about through life, putting those changes off. And because change pushes us out, it requires that we give something up. It requires sacrifice, it requires stepping into the unknown. And I think that's a huge part of kind of our walk with God. We want to often, when it comes to change, we want to tell God, I would do it if you can kind of guarantee the result that I want. If I could just know that I would be successful at this, then I'll do it. But the problem with change is that there is no guarantee that it's going to work out the way you thought. And so something that I've come to believe is that almost every amazing thing that God has for us in this life is on the other side of fear. And we have to step through fear to get where God is calling us, right? And so if I were going to say, why are people resistant to change? It's fear. They're afraid of the unknown. They're afraid of what it will cost them, and they're afraid it's not going to work out. It's not going to be worth it.
There was a certain time in my life I remember when the most important things in life to me were as follows. There was skateboards, there was girls, baseball, girls, video games, and girls. I may have mentioned that already once or twice. I just remember around age 11 or 12, this was my whole world. Riding a new board, waiting for the newest edition of Thrasher magazine to come out was at the top of the list. Skateboards were my life. Baseball practice, baseball games, thinking about baseball, watching baseball on TV was huge for me. Playing the newest Nintendo video game. Yes, that's right, the original NES where, you had to blow in the bottom of the cartridge when it didn't work. Some of you know what I'm talking about. That trumped everything else. I would cut out time for that no matter what. And of course, the ladies. It seems like a pretty simple list of priorities, right? But let me ask you this. What if I looked at my life today as a pastor of a church, father, husband, and said, you know what, I think my list of priorities is still skateboards, girls, baseball, etc., I'm pretty sure that'd be a problem. I'm pretty sure that'd be a serious problem. And what it brings up is that priorities are powerful. Priorities are the things we'll build our lives around and even give our lives, either literally or figuratively, we'll give our lives for them. My friends Tim and Alicia work in one of the poorest slums in Nairobi, Kenya. And after every presidential election, they go into hiding until they see that there are no riots and there's no violence in the streets. Why would people choose to live there? Why would they choose to do that? Well, they do that because their work with schools in poor slums is a priority to them, even though it costs them parts of their life that people their age in the U.S. take for granted. See, what happened to me when I was 11 was into that list of priorities, I put Jesus. Well, sort of. It wasn't perfect, but I decided at that age to become a follower of Jesus. And so some new things came to light for me. Some new things became priorities. I should probably figure out what this Bible thing is all about. Jesus keeps talking about loving other people. That takes time. That needs some space in my life. I need to talk to him. Pray, in other words. When's that going to happen? And the way I chase girls probably needs to change. Now, just because those things came into my list of priorities doesn't mean I became a saint overnight. Still not quite there. And I'll probably work at that project forever. Actually, I will work at that project forever. And no, I didn't give up skateboards or baseball or even girls. But within that list, my priorities changed. Different things went to the top. Jesus tells us this, and this is in my own words. He says, you have all kinds of things that are important. Priorities, in other words. What you're going to eat, what you're going to wear. And then he says, don't freak out about that. Don't worry about that. Instead, make one thing a priority that guides them all. Make God's kingdom first and being connected to him as first priority, and everything else is going to fall into place. What's God's kingdom? Well, God's kingdom is basically where God gets his way in our lives. Basically, make God's priorities your priorities, and things will fall into place the way they need to. Of course, for me as an 11-year-old, and even to this day, making God's kingdom a priority means that things change. And we know that things changing set us into this cycle of stuff dying, new things coming to life, and things never being the same again. I feel like this discussion is so important because we live every day. Everything we do because of what's most important. And most days, we have several most important things. We have competing priorities. And some of them have absolutely nothing to do with God getting his way. That's just reality. Some of them are emergencies. We didn't plan for them. Some of them we're just so accustomed to that we've actually forgotten that there are priorities. So how do we sift through everything that's going on in our lives and begin to change our priorities to reflect God's priorities? I think the first thing we have to do is we've got to acknowledge that we're not all powerful. I know, that's a shock. But maybe we just need to, wherever we are right now, raise our right hand and say, I confess here and now that I am not Superman or Superwoman or Superperson. You get what I mean. There's only so much room for so much activity in our life. There's only so much room for so many priorities in our lives. So when we say God's going to get his way, when the kingdom is the priority, then that one thing begins to shape and organize everything else. Here's an example. Back in the Bible, in the first part, the Old Testament, God gave his people this command. And he said, you work for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, you take that as what's called a Sabbath. And that word Sabbath literally means to cease. God basically said, work 6 days, and then you're commanded to do nothing on that 7th day. And you do that as a sign of your belief that God would take care of you, no matter what. Now, you and I have to think about this a little differently because our world's not quite the same. These guys didn't have 5-day-a-week jobs. They didn't have days off or vacation time. If they didn't farm, they didn't eat. So basically, they were trusting God that their work on those 6 days would be enough for the seventh. They were making God, not their own efforts, their priority. And they did nothing on those days. What would happen if you did that? What if you made a Sabbath, a rest of, 8 hours or so, a priority in your life? A way of saying that you know God will keep the world spinning even if you're not working. And you let your work and your life build up to that moment of rest and trust and worship. That might be a huge change, right? There are going to be other priorities in your life that have to get moved off or moved down. And those priorities might be people. And those priorities might get annoyed and irritated and come into conflict with you. So many of our conflicts are really caused when we try to put multiple most important things in our lives. And I get it, sometimes those priorities aren't under our control. An aging parent dealing with an illness keeps them homebound and needing constant care. That shifts our priorities a little bit. A season where you have a newborn infant who doesn't seem to understand how much we love sleep. That shifts our priorities. Our whole list changes. A change of job, a change of location, a season where our work is really busy, a time when we're dealing with personal illness or challenges, cancer treatments, etc. All of those things shift our priorities. So whether we choose our priorities to change or whether they're changed for us, all of that involves change. And that's where this map, where stuff dies, stuff comes to life, and stuff is never the same again, that's where that begins to help us. The first thing that happens when our priorities change, stuff dies. And what we need to do then is begin to grieve the things that are going away and just call them out. For example, we were talking about that new baby that comes into the world. When that happens, we grieve the rhythms of life, the sleep we used to have. It's just going away for now. My friends who work in Kenya, they had to grieve the loss of safety, at least the appearance of it, that they had when they lived in the States. We see that the way we used to use our time is changing. When our priority is getting healthier, we see that we have to let some things that we used to love die. Back in 2009, my wife and I lost 60 pounds each. We were really unhealthy. And so we cleaned everything out of our diets, and that's how it happened. Now that was hard, for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was I drove by a Burger King on the way home from work every single day. And every time I smelled that flame-broiled scent, it reminded me something was dying. It's just part of choosing new priorities. Stuff is going to die. But new priorities can also bring new stuff to life. We experience the beauty of that new baby. We experience the beauty of a new relationship that becomes important to us. When we make God's kingdom a priority, we start to see life and hope and light that wasn't there when our priorities didn't involve Him. You know, the Bible calls God our strong tower. And in times of difficulty, in times of change, we just run and we hide with Him. That's something beautiful that pops up when we make Him our priority. We find new strength to handle things. We find wisdom to make healthy priorities in our lives. Now, granted, I grieved Burger King not being a part of my life, but I also knew that I was healthier. My body was healthier. And I could engage more deeply in the things that God was moving me towards doing because my body was capable of it. I was going to be around longer. I could do more things. But also, new priorities mean that we can't go back. And things are going to be a little awkward. I like to think about people in my family who are really active, people who are doers. At work, they go hard at what they do. And I just wonder sometimes about the priority shift that's going to happen when they retire. What are they going to do with themselves when they have less to do and more time? It's going to be a huge change. It's going to take a while for them to figure out how to do life with those new priorities. So for us, if we change our priority list around and we make God's kingdom most important, we have to expect that things are just going to be awkward at first. Just like when you have a new relationship and you don't hang out with the guys like you used to. Or when you have a baby and you can't stay out late with your friends like you used to. Or for me, when you're 11 and you start going to church instead of staying on the baseball field until dark on Wednesday nights. It's going to take some getting used to. Now, I'm not saying you have to do all those things, but what I am saying is when you change your priorities, things are going to be really different. But I also know that when our priority change isn't what we want, or even when it is, we've got to know that we're going to go through this process of stuff dying, stuff coming to life, and stuff never being the same. So the question today is this: what's most important to you right now? If you had to do that same list I did at the beginning, what would be on it? What priority or priorities are you living by? Is God nudging you today to change them? How is He nudging you to change them? Maybe are your priorities in this season of your life outside of your control? And if so, how are you going through the process of change with these new priorities? I wonder, what would it look like today to make God's kingdom, life where God gets His way, most important to you? This is a question we're going to have to wrestle with when our priorities change.
In the quiet, in the stillness, I know that you are God. In the secret of your presence, I know there I am restored. And when you call, I won't refuse. And each new day again I'll choose. And there is no one else for me, none but Jesus, crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring Him praise. In the chaos, in confusion, I know You're sovereign still. In the moment of my weakness, You give me strength to do Your will. And when You call, I won't delay. This my song through all my days. my strength, and all my delight is in you, Lord, forevermore. There is no one else for me, none but Jesus, crucified to set me free. Now I live to bring